Over the past 4.5 decades, Stephen King, America's reigning master of horror, has written 60 novels, 5 nonfiction books, over 200 short stories, a smattering of screenplays, a handful of comic books, enough essays to fill a collection, and an episode of The X-Files. What have you been doing with your time? Even if you're a diehard Stephen King fan, this can all be a bit hard to keep up with. The dude's a machine, churning out best-selling material at a rate that can't even be matched by people half his age. He's a goddamn boss. But here's something you might not know, and here I'm specifically speaking to the casual Stephen King fans, not those of you who clear the board every time there's a Stephen King round at bar trivia. I know you folks know what's up. This one's for your neighbors.
How do sagas work, and how do we get to use them in our games to create the most epic of epicnesses ever? Well, let's jump right into it. So, sagas, the most important thing that we need to bear in mind with sagas is that they are in threes. Sagas come in threes. Anything more than a saga, when you start getting quadrilogies and you start getting even more than that, pentatrilogy, I don't even know what you would call it, a heptatrilogy. I mean, once you start over 3, you're really starting to milk it for all it's worth, and there hasn't been a lot of things that have worked very, very well. There have been some, admittedly, Harry Potter, for example, but generally speaking, they're not that engaging. We simply don't have enough material to keep them working. So, how do we work it out? It works in threes, and this is the way that it works. Each one of these is a campaign. Bear that in mind. Each one of these is a campaign. Now, if your campaign happens to run over 6 months, then you could, in theory, have a saga that runs out in a year and a half. If your campaign runs over a year, you've got 3 years worth of play. As long as your campaign is times by 3, that's how long your saga is going to be. There's a reason why it's called a saga and not just a campaign. It does help if you have crazy, crazy hair too, because it definitely is a campaign saga rather than just a campaign, because crazy hair is always indicative. So how does it work? What is our stock standard approach for a saga? Well, the Greek sagas that we look at, the Danish sagas that we look at, Beowulf, for example, the saga of Beowulf. When we look at sagas, they usually work in this cycle. And when you understand how the 1-to-1 act structure works, when you understand how narrative imperative works, you start to see why.
Okay, so obviously I love The Dark Tower. I'm a huge fan of Stephen King, and The Dark Tower is his biggest, craziest story ever. It's this creative buffet of King Arthur and Lord of the Rings, the American Western, and sci-fi, stocked with cyborgs and shootouts and haunted houses and actual Spider-Man, and a nutbag villain inspired by Robert Chambers and Robert Fripp. I mean, like I said, I love it. But what makes the series even more fun to me is how over time it drew in King's other stories, heroes and villains, places and concepts, all unifying in the shadow of the tower. Other videos have done a good job summing up those core connections. Check out the Birth Movies Death video I've linked below, and light a candle for Birth Movies Death. But I want to do things a little differently. I want to see how the Dark Tower universe grew over time, specifically how King wove together 13 elements like a seamstress at the loom or a spider at the branch. And I want to share that with you. So please, come along, because I think the journey through the Dark Tower universe is just as cool as the destination. It all starts in 1970. Stephen King attends a screening of The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. Along with the Robert Browning poem Childe Roland to the Dark Tower Came, it gives him the idea for the Dark Tower, this epic fantasy series about a cowboy knight questing for a mystical nexus of all existence. But the idea seems way too big this soon in his career, so King sets it aside. For now. A few years later, he writes the story of vampires overrunning a small town named Salem's Lot. Among the victims is a priest named Father Callahan. Remember that name. Following that, 2 Salem's Lot short stories. One for the Road explores the fallout from the novel, while Jerusalem's Lot explores the town's origins. Next, in Night Surf, beach-bound teenagers die of a superflu. And in Nona, police jail a teenage psychopath in a small town that King later names Castle Rock. Then survivors of that same superflu from Night Surf battle a wizard named Randall Flagg in the Stand. It's 1978 now, and King, emboldened by his success, releases chapters of The Dark Tower in magazines. The journey's officially begun. But Stephen King immediately returns to Castle Rock and a psychic assassin in the Dead Zone. And then grocery store customers fight off interdimensional monsters in the mist. That dimensional travel will become important. But back in Castle Rock, a St. Bernard terrorizes a mother and child. Then finally, 12 years after inception, King collects and publishes The Dark Tower, the Gunslinger, the first book to follow Roland, a hero who quests through the ruins of Midworld for the tidal tower. But then King goes back to Castle Rock again for 4 boys and a dead body, and also a truck that roars to hungry life, and also a car that takes supernatural shortcuts. But then King writes The Eyes of the Dragon, a fairy tale that definitely has Flag from the Stand and might be set in Roland's Midworld too. Put a pin in that. And also put a pin in his Peter Straub collaboration, The Talisman, where the heroes teleport into a fantasy land that also looks like Roland's universe. Anyway, back on Earth, a godlike turtle oversees the final battle with an interdimensional monster in It, which is set in a small town named Derry. And finally, 5 years after The Gunslinger, Stephen King publishes The Drawing of the Three, a sequel that name-checks heroes from The Eyes of the Dragon and Randall Flagg from The Stand, which means the Dark Tower universe isn't just advancing, it's expanding. But then King steps away again for the Tommyknockers, which features a character who makes a supply run through Derry. King also goes back to Castle Rock, where a ghostly pseudonym attacks the author who made him, and also a creepy camera takes pictures of an approaching bloodthirsty dog. Thankfully, King returns to the quest 4 years later as Roland and company journey through the Wastelands, where Roland mentions a godlike turtle named Maturin. Yep, the same turtle from It, which means the tower connects to the turtle and to the town of Derry. And then King returns to Castle Rock again, but this time he's closing shop with Needful Things, the last Castle Rock story, and thank God I was getting kinda sick of it. Fine, It Grows on You tracks a bizarre growing house also in Castle Rock. And back in that other town, an insomniac battles servants of a villain called the Crimson King, a strange creature who has deadly designs for Roland the Gunslinger. Oh, and also a woman escapes an abuser by transporting into Midworld. And 2 novels set in twin dimensions feature an interdimensional beast named Tak. In Everything's Eventual, a company forces a young man to commit psychic assassinations, hang on to that one, because 6 friggin' years after Wastelands, King finally publishes Wizard in Glass. In its pages, Roland sees the sigil of the Crimson King from Insomnia, and King tells us there are only 3 books left to write. Back on Earth, a book-writing widower travels through Derry and Castle Rock, which connects goddamn Castle Rock to the Dark Tower universe that never ends. Next, in Hearts in Atlantis, strange enemies named Lowmen chase after a powerful old psychic, while a rebel girl allies herself with Randall Flagg. And back in Derry, an author finds a supernatural painting with a monstrous car. And right when King feels the urge to return to the tower again, a car strikes him during his daily walk and nearly kills him. Yeah, right, like he'd let that stop him. Doped up on painkillers, King writes a Derry novel that's sort of like Aliens, but if the aliens skipped your chest and popped out of your ass. As King gets better, he and Peter Straub pit the heroes of the Talisman against the Crimson King in Midworld on behalf of captured psychics who are now called Breakers. And he also tosses out another supernatural car story, as a treat. Then King buckles down and focuses. He writes Wolves of the Calla, where Roland and his friends fight alongside Father Callahan, the priest from Salem's Lot. See? Told you to remember him. King also gives us a name for his version of interdimensional travel. He calls it going Todash. And in 2004, 34 years after first getting the idea, King finally completes his story with Song of Susanna and the Dark Tower. The core connections have been made, the author can rest, the tale is told. But the 13 elements persist, so let's wrap up. Standing stones in a main field struggle to contain a Todash monstrosity. A lowman retrieves a supernatural Kindle. An invisible Todash dome cuts off a small town. A pathetic man's wife dies unexceptionally in Castle Rock. A selfish man in Derry strikes a Faustian pact. A time-traveling teacher trying to save JFK stops through Derry. And finally, good lord, finally, we end the journey the way we started, with 3 small-town stories, this time in Castle Rock, but instead of a well-intentioned priest, we get our old buddy Randall Flagg. So, look, I know it can give you a headache trying to sort through all of this, and I try to limit my criteria. But I think there's also a generosity in how King rewards readers by revisiting classic characters, places, and ideas. It's a joy to see Beverly Marsh in 11/22/63, to see Ted Brodigan in the Dark Tower, to see new visions of Todash monstrosities, or to see Flagg change from a one-off boogeyman into a comment on cyclical violence. Because sure, the lines and circles here don't reflect the omniscient mastermind who had a grand plan, but I sometimes think grand plans are overrated, and this is something a little cooler, a writer who found his way through, making connections as he discovered them.
Oh, so you thought putting 27 movies in a timeline was hard? You ain't seen nothing yet. Today we're putting more than 60 films into one cohesive timeline, creating the Disney theory to end them all. Hello Hello, Internet! Welcome to Film Theory, the show that always says, "Hey, theorists!" So, for as much as we get on them for the strange, often awful decisions they make, Disney has made a lot of great movies over the 100 years they've been around. Specifically, their animation is some of the most beloved in the world. There's a lot of genuine nostalgia for these stories, and I wondered, well, what if they were all part of the same story? What if there was one complete, cohesive Disney timeline of the Disney universe? The Disneyverse, if you will. Now, you may have seen this sort of idea around the internet before, specifically with the Pixar theory. This was a fun project originally created by John Negroni and picked up by fellow theorists like the Super Carlin brothers, trying to fit all of the Pixar movies into one complete timeline. It's a big challenge, and one that I really respect those creators for taking on. And I wanted to throw my hat into the ring with something similar. The Disney theory, doing the same thing with all of Disney's movies. Matt had previously connected a handful of Disney movies with cameos and Easter eggs, but I wanted to do them all, from Snow White to Moana 2. And it turned out much longer than I anticipated. Like, seriously, I was thinking this would be a special 25 to 30 minute video. And this turned into an epic that was over 45 minutes. So yeah, this is a multi-part series with part 2 coming by the end of the month. So, okay, how are we gonna be doing this? What are our rules? Like, most of Disney's movies are pretty ambiguous about when and where they take place, and putting them all together is gonna be a bit janky. But basically, we're going to be looking at all of the historical settings, landscapes, clothes, source material, cameos, and Easter eggs across all of the films to tie them together as best we can. And shoutouts to the awesome fan wikis and channel Mickeyology for being great resources for a lot of the information regarding all of that jazz. They were excellent starting points and just invaluable for us today. Regardless, the most important thing for us is to make sure that the main 62 films in the Disney canon fit in here. If you don't know, the Disney canon are the movies made specifically by Walt Disney Animation Studios. This is Disney's main animation studio that makes their tentpole, big-budget movies directly associated with the Disney brand. Just to be clear, that doesn't include other studios they've owned, the likes of Pixar or Blue Sky Studios or Image Movers or whatever. Like, those are their own things, and maybe we'll get to them someday. For the most part, it also doesn't include works from Disney Toon Studios or Disney Television Animation. Those were the people behind the direct-to-video sequels or animated series spin-offs for the main Disney canon. That being said, sometimes these sequels and spin-offs will have details that will help us definitively place the movies or support the world that we're building here. In those cases, we'll be using them, but we will make sure to call that out. But again, the most important thing for this theory is getting those main 62 films placed. Those extras are just a nice bonus if they fit in too. Oh, but with all of that done and dusted, loyal theorists, let's get right into the magic. Okay, so right off the bat, there's a common thread that ties all of the movies in the Disney canon together, and it's a sprinkling of that Disney magic. No, I mean literally, Disney magic. The thing that distinguishes this universe apart from ours is magic. Whether that be through talking animals or ghosts or just straight up wizards. So the first thing to do here is figure out, where does that magic come from? Well, the answer is simple. Stars. I'm talking wishing stars, shooting stars, magic from the sun, which is just a big old star. For whatever reason, in the Disneyverse, stars are inherently magical and can pass that magic along to whatever they touch. And that is, well, everything. See, in the real world, everything is made of star stuff, elements that were first created inside of stars. The same thing is happening here, just with magic alongside the science. As the corniest song in Wish put it,
if you really want to know just who you are, you're a star.
We usually have an introduction of the heroes. This is your most vanilla epic campaign that you can run, if you like. The heroes get embroiled in some kind of battle, they save the day, they save the world, and all is right, or so it seems. Now, this is a very, very important period in our saga, because, and you're going to see a little bit later on why, I'm going to come back to it. The Nemesis victory. This is the second campaign. Once you have established that you are going to have a saga, and we're going to talk about how you establish that next slide, but once you've established that you're going to have a saga, this is what should happen next. The Nemesis should triumph. This is where the players have been struggling against that evil galactic overlord. They've been fighting against Cthulhu, and in this one, they defeated the priest who was summoning Cthulhu. They defeated the warlord and his massive, undefeatable starship. They defeated the dragon that was supposedly riling everybody up. In this campaign, series of adventures all linked together as you would under normal circumstances create a campaign. The nemesis wants something badly and is having difficulty getting it. In this one, we discover that there is a nemesis behind the one that the players defeated in this campaign. The nemesis is more powerful. The nemesis is more intelligent. The nemesis is stronger than the players ever thought they could possibly be. This one ends on a low note. It is at this point, this is the epic campaign that concludes with the players stuck in a different dimension and a cutaway to, and as your characters are frustrated for not being able to escape from this prison, without, the world burns, and the great kingdom of Evermore is no longer. It is trampled underneath the dark marched boots of the Imperial army that has now taken control over all that you had so valiantly fought to save before. And scene.
Let's go through some themes and techniques in Del Toro's world-building process. Maybe we'll get your creative juices flowing.
The Matrix is a system, Neo.
Step 1. There's geography, politics, religion maybe, technology and science, warfare, fashion, language, culture, art. So many things to research, learn, understand, before you can even begin to put together worlds. The larger and more complex the world, the more you need to know. You don't get points for making things more complex, but the setting must tie in with your story. Just adding detail for the sake of it is a waste of time and energy.
We are in a paradox where we have super sophisticated social language that makes it almost impossible to be imperfect. Racism, classism, brutal divisions through fear and hatred that you thought were dormant or gone for 50 years, they're coming back. So there's a paradox at play. And the only place that I think that the only place I find refuge and solace and forgiveness is in monsters.
Guillermo del Toro is extremely well-read and articulate. He spent 10 years practicing makeup, and at one point even owned a studio that did prosthetics and visual effects. On some movies, he is also credited in the production design. He's an accomplished artist in his own right. It has taken him his whole life to get to the point he is now, so I don't want you to start thinking world building on his level is easy. It's a good idea to start small, like he did in Chronos. Focus on doing one thing well first. Step 2. There are 2 ways to start world building. SimCity or Civilization is a good reference. You can either start with a few homes and grow out, or you can sit back, look at the map, and plan your city before you start building. I prefer the latter approach.
Plan, but don't plan. Oh dear, what the hell does that mean? Plan but don't plan? How is that useful?
This means you first decide on the overall story and themes. Why is this better? It will help you confine your research to what is actually required rather than spending endless days on researching things you might never need. It's easy to get lost in the details. The objects in his world appear used and damaged, an idea he religiously follows borrowed from Star Wars. Each thing is part of the larger puzzle, and there are no wasteful details that don't belong. The details can be just for one shot, like the kaiju bones at the beginning of Pacific Rim, but it tells a whole story and deepens our understanding of the setting.
The group would adopt the name the Society of Explorers and Adventurers. In 1700, the golden age of piracy began. This is almost right as the Renaissance ends. The era is defined by pirates being known as the true dominant force of the seas, so much so that the governments of the world would now fear these now legendary figures. In 1776, after decades of cultural divide,
while Castle Rock attempted to make all of King's stories work alongside one another, another film did its best to try and connect every existing film in King's filmography together. That film is The Dark Tower, and if you haven't seen it, well, I don't really blame you. It's a pretty run-of-the-mill fantasy film, not too bad, but nothing spectacular either. This film is loaded with Easter eggs and references to all of Stephen King's works, from a book actually written by Stephen King to the poster of Rita Hayworth from The Shawshank Redemption. The film almost faults itself on how much it tries to connect all of King's works. As you can probably already tell from this video, connecting all of the films together is a pretty difficult task, so you can imagine that a movie dedicated to trying to tie all these stories together while also telling its own story is a pretty tall order. This film touches on all the different aspects of King's works. The main character Jake has the ability to shine, though in this film it's referred to as the touch. Both Jake and the film's main antagonist, the Man in Black, played by Matthew McConaughey, have the ability to shine, and the Man in Black is, perhaps unintentionally, the figure that connects all of King's works together. The Man in Black has the ability to travel across time and parallel worlds, allowing him to pop up in many of King's different stories and subsequently films, even if his alternate identities aren't immediately brought up. While he has many different aliases, his most common alias is Randall Flagg, who you might have seen in The Stand. Man in Black pops up in many other shows and movies as well, though not all of his identities are confirmed. There's many different theories that pose the Man in Black as the antagonist in every single one of King's works. This would mean that Pennywise is actually the Man in Black, as well as El Cuco from The Outsider, and really any other of King's works that have a supernatural antagonist. While Randall Flagg or the Man in Black has only been on screen in a few different entries, this theory would suggest the Man in Black is in fact all of these different creatures. Will we ever have confirmation on this theory? I guess only time will tell. For a while, we were left with a few fan theories about what happened after the camera stopped rolling, where the monster came from and why, and with a few answers from Abrams along the years, such as how the monster came from the ocean and it was only a baby, it seemed that the Cloverfield franchise, well, wasn't a franchise, just a single movie.
So, the idea is that the Nemesis wins here. The players are left with their characters in a predicament, locked away, defeated in some way. Now, there are some classic sagas that have played out and have used this model. I'm not going to go into them, but generally speaking, this is the darkest of the campaigns. It's the most difficult, and you have to have informed your players that they are playing in a saga in order for them not to end this campaign going, oh my god, this is so terrible, it's so bleak, it's so dark, I'm not happy, I'm going somewhere else, I want My Little Pony. I'm not going to be playing in this thing for no, done, thanks. You must let them know that they're playing in a saga and that this is the cycle that they are in. Now, does that take agency away from them? Does that cause the players to go, oh, well, then, if you're just controlling the whole story, what's the point in playing? No, it doesn't. They're there for the journey, and they can influence it, and they should influence it. If we turn our attention, say, to one of the greatest sagas ever,
let's track this from the beginning. Start with something pure. Something exciting. Then deal with something new. Yeah. Told you. Okay so far? You like it? I'm feeling it. Why stop there? This is it. This is the path I started us on.
Our very strength invites challenge. Challenge incites conflict. Conflict breeds catastrophe. The thing isn't beautiful because it lasts.
I am inevitable. sweet-ass run it's been. Epic forces of darkness and light. What a world. Universe now.
Jedi, but nonetheless, there we go. So it played out, and we were left for years, because films used to take much longer than you know, they would come out, but it took years before the third film came out, and we finally got our justice, where the heroes seemed to overcome tremendous odds, which were even bigger. And that leads us to our third campaign, the PC victory. Now, this one is the most challenging for you to operate as the game master. This one needs to go on a bigger scale than before. So if the PCs in the first one blew up a Death Star, in this one they can't blow up a Death Star because that's boring, we've done it already. Now they need to blow up a bigger Death Star whilst at the same time fighting the entire fleet of the Empire, as well as facing the Emperor in the Dark Tower with Darth Vader. Everyone's just got to come together, and it's got to be absolutely terrifying. So in other words, this one is the one where you need to pull out all the stops. So this battle was big and climatic at the end. This one needs to be even bigger and bolder. Again, look at the Avengers saga. We've had 3 of them, technically, and this is how they have run as well. There was a little fudging in the middle where the Nemesis seemed to have victory, or did they? No. The Avengers were scattered, fighting each other at each other's throats. And then we move into the final film, which needed 2 films in order to be told, which I loved it. No spoilers, don't worry. I loved it. It was ultimately, it got to this point because, well, they need to release more films. So we kind of knew where it was going. But this final battle was the biggest battle in the history of cinema making.
Why? Again, repetition. But it's not the what, but the how of the repetition that matters.
Yes, girlie. Now, make a wish. And take a bite.
I grew up around fables and classic fairy tales, which, in retrospect, were quite long and convoluted. But I still recall most of them in detail.
Now take the apple, dearie. And make a wish.
Because of this magical number.
Fine. Now take a bite.
Cinderella visits the ball and dances with the prince 3 times. Little Red Riding Hood's grandmother lives in a house under 3 oak trees. Sleeping Beauty has 3 fairies by her side. And 3 little pigs, well, 3 little pigs. The reason why so many classic fairy tales have things repeated 3 times is because 3 is a number that resolves. When something happens twice, we notice a pattern. But when something happens thrice, we confirm the pattern, a resolution. Pan's Labyrinth 2 is a fairy tale at its core, albeit a dark one. And so Guillermo del Toro embeds the rule of 3 within the film's complicated structure to unify the stories, the perspectives, and the themes into a coherent assemblage.
Believe me, I wanted to scrap this video and work on something else, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there must be something somewhere out there that gives us just another glimpse of this behind-the-scenes metaverse world. So I kept searching, and searching, and searching, and searching everywhere I could think of. The Pixar Wikipedia, the Disney Plus spin-offs and short films. I even watched fucking Mater's Tall Tales, and there was still nothing I could use. But then I realized I was looking in the wrong place. Pixar always re-releases their movies on DVD, and a lot of these DVDs have special features and bonus content like creator interviews, deleted scenes, old promotional material, and most importantly, the blooper segments. If there's more metaverse content out there, I bet you it's on these DVDs. So I bought as many DVDs as I could find and started looking through every single menu item until I found a little something called character interviews.
That's beside the point. So 3s, got to work in 3s. I need to speed up. Okay, so bigger. Every time it's a step up. Every time it's a step up. Every time it's bigger. Bigger setting. Bigger odds. Smaller relationships. What do I mean by this? The setting needs to be bigger. So in the first one, where we are just introducing the characters to the world, to the players. The characters being introduced to the players. They're discovering who they are. They're learning about them. They're leveling up. They're powering up. They're earning their pips. They're whatever your system has for advancement. They're getting into the world. The next one has to be bigger. So now the little kingdom that they were in, now they're starting to fight in kingdoms around. Or it's not just this galaxy, it's the entire universe. Because in the third one, it's not just the universe, it's the multiverse. So we need to always get bigger. The odds need to get bigger. The first one, it's a small singular location. When we look again to Star Wars, they had to simply blow up one Death Star. They weren't fighting the entire Empire. It was just a Death Star that they needed to blow up. If we look at the Aliens trilogy, the first three anyway, before they brought out the fourth one, although the fourth one does make it a rather complete saga, but if we look at the Aliens trilogy, the first one was fighting one alien in a starship with fairly unprepared crew. The second one was fighting hundreds of aliens all over the place and making it so much darker because now we realize that the corporation Wayland Yutani was evil and was just trying to get these things for warfare.
But I mean, do you think it's any coincidence that this guy looks like an agent from the Matrix?
Coincidence? I think not!
Exactly, Bernie, you get it!
This also explains why the toy actors need to eat.
I had that bean burrito for lunch.
It's because they're not really toys. Sure, they actually look like them on the outside, but they probably have internal organs and all the same basic needs as any living thing. Okay, fine. But why do the actors in the metaverse still call themselves by their character names, even out of character?
Woody!
My name is Flick.
Oh, come on, Buzz!
You're right, Woody.
Well, if we're going off of Toy Story logic, when the actors are created, I think they're also given the same beliefs and personality of whatever character they're supposed to represent. It's like in Toy Story 1 when Buzz literally thought he was a real human space ranger despite being a tiny toy.
I'm Buzz Lightyear, Space Ranger, Universe Protection Unit.
You actually think you're the Buzz Lightyear?
It's because he was made to be that character. In fact, this is probably also why Bullseye or the Queen's Aphid, two characters that are meant to be just regular, non-speaking animal pets.
Bullseye, go, 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 go.
Isn't that right, Aphid? Of course.
It's because this is the belief they were imbued with. And it makes sense because, you know, if you believe you are a character, you're gonna give the most believable performance. Okay, but here's a tough one. How come the bird from A Bug's Life was actually a fake animatronic robot? You know, if Pixar can easily bring to life any animated character they want, why bother building a robot for this scene? Doesn't this kind of disprove my whole theory? Actually, it helps prove it. In A Bug's Life, this bird is a regular, unintelligent, wild bird. All it does throughout the entire movie is just mindlessly attack other bug characters. So, if Pixar was to actually bring this bird to life, it would always have the belief that it's just a mindless wild bird that wants to eat bugs all the time, even when they aren't filming, just like Bullseye or the Aphid, which would obviously be way too dangerous for a film set full of bug characters, hence why they have a fake animatronic bird instead. Starting to all kind of make sense, isn't it? What else do we got? Why are the sizes of the toys, bugs, and monsters all so inconsistent in the bloopers? Well, if Pixar can create life in any form they choose, there's nothing stopping them from just creating an extra small or extra big copy of a character. In fact, we already know Pixar sometimes makes many copies of the same character.
I can't believe this. That's the fifth time. What is that guy in?
And the two instances where we see these size differences are both jokes that rely on the characters being way too big or small.
Hey, Ted! Good morning!
The gag just wouldn't work if they were all the same size. So yeah, I think Pixar just created extra small Bugs Life characters or an extra big Rex just for this one gag. Or honestly, this is probably just the same giant Rex from the opening of Toy Story 3. Alright, cool. So this theory seems to fix a lot of the weird, small contradictions in the bloopers. But what about the biggest contradiction in the entire metaverse? The one I've been avoiding talking about.
Then we go to the third one. Now, the third one was the darkest of them. It was in a prison situation, but there was ultimate victory at the ultimate cost. Then they brought in the fourth one, which, although it is part of the entire series, they tried to ramp up. They tried to make it bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And although the budget was bigger for the fourth film, did they ramp up the odds? Some might say yes, some might say no. I say no. I felt that it was just a rehash, a very pretty rehash, entertaining nonetheless, but it didn't kind of take us anywhere new. So the first three certainly did that. But the relationships need to be smaller. So as you advance, as your campaign turns into a saga, the relationships with the NPCs need to get smaller. And by smaller, I don't mean less. By smaller, I mean more intimate. But I didn't want to write intimate there. So I mean that the groups that are involved in this process are intimately involved. So it's not just a case of, hello, Bob the blacksmith. It's, hello, Bob, how is your wife? How is your child? We develop those relationships so that the NPCs move forward. Look at how Lando Calrissian in the Star Wars films went from being just the swindler to being important. Now, when we look at all 6 films, supposedly, when you put them all together, he's now supposedly back in this last one. Certainly the trailer would indicate that. So we now see this journey of the NPCs as they grow and evolve. And they grow and they evolve in the relationships that are formed between the PCs and the NPCs. You must work on your NPC relationship. Even if your PCs, if your players are not the kind that really get involved with the NPCs, work on it. Drive it forward. Yes, you have to have big set pieces, you have to have big battles, you have to have big staging, but work on those smaller relationships and it will make the entire story feel bigger, because now it's not just the PCs who are invested. It's the PCs plus the NPCs that they have fallen in love with that are now involved and invested. So we need to do that.
Alright, make sure the polarity is reversed. The anomaly detector is set to 0. Don't want to set that to 1 like last time. That was bad. Okay, no time like the present. 3, 2, 1. Oh, okay, no, it's working this time. It's getting really hot. Bright white light. Oh, is my skin red?
After the Big Bang and the formation of all these magic stars, the first thing we see is the Rite of Spring sequence from Fantasia, which shows us the formation of Earth and the development of life, leading up to the age of the dinosaurs. That naturally takes us to Disney's Dinosaur, set in the Cretaceous period at least 65 million years ago, when the dinosaurs would have existed alongside the ancestors of lemurs. But of course, the dinosaurs couldn't last forever, and just like in our universe, a meteor impacts the planet and kills them off. We actually see a lot of them die in that same Rite of Spring sequence in Fantasia. It's dark. But that wasn't the end of life on the planet, and in fact, the star magic would basically supercharge the rest of the life on Earth. In Fantasia 2000, the humpback whale sequence opens up with the star shining down on the ocean. And then, the Northern Lights. This is a phenomenon caused by the Earth's magnetosphere interacting with the sun's light. The sun itself is just a star, so that makes the Northern Lights magic in this universe. And believe me, we'll get to that in a second. Regardless, this sets the stage for magic to spread across the skies, allowing those whales to take flight. We're dating this sequence back to 120,000 years ago, after humpback whales migrated to the pine tree populated northern hemisphere, but before the most recent ice age fully set in. And along with these flying humpback whales, all of the magic also allows for the emergence of various creatures that are only legends in our world. Giants and dragons, nymphs and fairies, mermaids, and all manner of mythological beasts and supersized species. Additionally, it left many animals capable of understanding human speech, and gifted some with the ability to speak, though that doesn't really become relevant until much, much later. This brings us to the dawn of human civilization, with the rise of Atlantis around 13,000 BC, as seen in Atlantis: The Lost Empire. Just to put that into perspective, that would have been during the last ice age. The technology of Atlantis was driven by magic crystals above the city, which were conspicuously compared to stars.
Then, bright light, like a star, floating above the city.
Further proof that magic comes from stars in this world. However, as the Atlantean Empire thrived, other less advanced human civilizations were also popping up across the world, each with their own relationship with this star magic. For instance, we have Brother Bear, set in what is now Alaska, around 9,500 BC. We can place it there since it takes place in that sweet spot between the last ice age wrapping up, but before the extinction of the Columbian mammoth. In the film, we once again see traces of magic from the stars in the northern lights. Told you we'd be getting back to that one. And in Brother Bear, we see this magic has the power to interact with both human and animal spirits, literally transforming Kenai into a bear. Across the planet, humans start recognizing the power of magic and sought to bottle it up and harness it for themselves. Sometimes they did this in the literal bottles. This gave rise to races of magical beings like the genies, concentrated personifications of that wishing magic. Unfortunately, we know from the Aladdin animated series that genies were later hunted to near extinction, perhaps due to some backlash against magic, considering the devastation that could occur if it fell into the wrong hands. Only a few survivors, like Aladdin's genie, were spared and hidden away in places like the Cave of Wonders. We can actually clock Genie's imprisonment starting in 8600 BC, since
10,000 years will give you such a crick in the neck.
And we know that Aladdin takes place in 1400 AD. We'll get there, I promise. And here is where we get to the most pivotal point in the early Disneyverse, the year 7000 BC and the fall of Atlantis, as seen in that movie's prologue. Using their magically fueled technology, Atlantis accidentally nuked the whole planet and created a giant tidal wave. Whoopsie! This led to the sinking of Atlantis and a great flood that hit the entire planet, as referenced by Milo and Kida later in the movie.
Such knowledge has been lost to us since the time of the Maybermok.
Oh, the Great Flood.
This is also where the Noah's Ark sequence from Fantasia 2000 would fit in, where we see Noah save the animals and ferry them to the only sliver of land that's not completely submerged. So that's good news for Noah and his animals, but what about the rest of humanity? Kind of hard to come back from the whole world getting flooded, isn't it? Well, thankfully, there were parts of civilization like Avalonia from Strange World that were able to survive on the backs of giant turtles. Yeah, really. These were likely created by the magic that brought back life after the dinosaurs, and we see in Strange World that they're using the flooded planet as their own personal swimming pool. And believe it or not, but this isn't even the only example of this we see in the Disney canon. In the direct-to-video sequel Aladdin and the King of Thieves, the gang discover the remnants of an ancient civilization built on the back of a giant turtle. Sound familiar? That's just further proof that humans were forced to resettle on the backs of these giant turtles until the continents re-emerged. Oh, and just as a little bonus here, we actually have a direct connection between Atlantis and Strange World. We see an Atlantean book written in its distinctive language at the end of Strange World, suggesting that the fall of Atlantis was studied by the surviving humans. However, eventually Avalonia would have been flooded again as the giant turtles died, or just decided to go back underwater. They got a little divine intervention from some very powerful individuals, thus beginning Disney's Age of the Gods. Yeah, at this point, higher powers swoop in to reshape the world and fix the mess left behind by Atlantis. The first to step up is Tafiti, who raised the land from the ocean and unflooded the planet.
In the beginning, there was only ocean, until the mother island emerged.
But Tafiti was only one such powerful being. There were others, including the Titans and other giant monsters like Tamatoa, who brought chaos to the world, earthquakes and volcanoes that never slept. Enter other pantheons like the Greek gods, who imprisoned the Titans and monsters beneath the seas to help humanity thrive. These prisons became small worlds unto themselves, like Lalotai in Moana, and Wonderland in Alice in Wonderland. Even some powerful mortal sorcerers were imprisoned in similar worlds or trapped in items like cauldrons.
In the dark spirit, since no prison could hold him, he was thrown alive into a crucible of molten iron.
Dang, man, Zeus don't mess around. Regardless, only creatures that could feasibly coexist with humans were allowed to hang around. Dragons and mermaids were left off the hook, as were certain demigods like Maui, who set humanity up for success by taming nature. Speaking of demigods, this actually leads us to the story of Hercules, set in 1000 BC. We know this thanks to a date we can see on a credit card in the movie. Guess all that wish magic also got capitalism a jumpstart in this timeline. This film also shows us that gods are still running the show, since we see the Greek pantheon and Hercules almost ascend to become one of them. Oh, and just before we move on, Hercules also lets us place the Lion King and all of its ancestor star magic roughly at the same time. See, one of the famous labors of Hercules in Greek myth to prove that he was a hero was killing the Nemean lion, a beast that was terrorizing the town of Nemea. Well, in the Disney movie, we see Hercules wearing a lion pelt that is identical to Scar. So somehow, Scar survived survived being attacked by the hyenas in The Lion King, made his way up to Greece, and was eventually defeated by Hercules. And just to get it out of the way, yes, the Timon and Pumbaa series features those two in the modern day, but those aren't the same Timon and Pumbaa from the movie universe. Timon in the films has 5 stripes on his back, but only 3 in the show, so it's non-canon or some weird alternate universe. But enough about that, let's get back to the Disney gods. Something happened that drove the gods away, or made them take a hands-off approach moving forward, and that thing was the Droon from Raya and the Last Dragon. In the year 800 BC, dark entities known as the Droon spread across the world with the power to turn any creature into stone. And though you might not be able to kill a god, you can trap them forever on a rock. So how can we put this at 800 BC? Well, we know that the Droon rose to power 500 years before the main events of Raya.
Well, that all began 500 years ago.
And given the presence of iron weapons and crossbows in the main story, we can estimate that Raya is set around 300 BC, so 500 years before that would make this 800 BC. Regardless, after the gods left, magical beings called dragons defeated the Droon in the fictional Southeast Asian subcontinent of Kumandra, though they were themselves trapped in stone. 500 years later, the Droon were released once again during the main events of Raya before being defeated once and for all. With the Droon finally gone for good, humanity once again thrives, though Polynesia suffers after the demigod Maui steals the heart of Te Fiti and triggers a slowly encroaching wave of darkness that drains life from the islands across the Pacific. Don't worry, we'll get back to that story shortly, but first we have to take a brief pit stop in Europe. Here we have the Black Cauldron. Yeah, I bet you forgot about this one. Honestly, I thought that this one was going to be a challenge since it takes place in a fantasy world known as Prydain, until I dug into it and discovered that Prydain is just another name for the country of Wales in Great Britain, thus setting it firmly on Earth. Anyway, this film has to take place around the 500s AD, since the helmet that Taran imagines himself wearing resembles a Spangen helm, a real type of helmet popular during this century. Likewise, this leads us directly into the Sword in the Stone, set just a slight jaunt away in 500s England. Here, King Arthur rises to power to become a legendary hero under the tutelage of the mage Merlin. This is the date range typically given for Arthurian legend, which more or less lines up with what we see in the film. We're also going to set the famous Sorcerer's Apprentice story from Fantasia here, which sees the sorcerer Yen Sid and his apprentice, a strange humanoid mouse creature named Mickey. These animal-human hybrids will become much more common later on in the timeline and are likely the result of star magic really fast-tracking evolution of other species. Anyway, we're placing this here because of the similarity between Yen Sid and Merlin's attire, and the similar use of magic. That's not to say they're the same character, but they are clearly peers. And now, back to the Pacific to round out the first millennium. We have Moana and Moana 2. These are set in Polynesia during the 900s, and we can chalk this date up to some real-world history. See, Moana's story unfolds during a period called the Long Pause. This was a time when the exploration of the ocean by the Polynesian peoples stalled for over 1,000 years and ended in the 10th century. Well, in the Disneyverse, this came to an end thanks to Moana's adventure to Te Fiti, which reignites the desire to explore in her people. What's up, guys? Future Lee here. I just saw Moana 2 and wanted to talk about how it impacts the timeline. Mostly, it doesn't. There was a joke in this movie where Maui said that the gods may have butt-dialed Moana, and no one knew what he was talking about, but that it would make sense in about 2,000 years. At first, that concerned me because, hey, that doesn't line up with present day, especially if this is set in like 900 AD. But there are multiple other instances where it does line up with that timeline of about 900 AD. The last Tautai before Moana is said to have been about 1,000 years ago, which lines up with the Great Pause. And likewise, Matangi, the Bat Lady, was trapped in that giant clam for 1,000 years. Again, all of that lines up with the Great Pause, so we're going to say that Dwayne Johnson just ad-libbed that line, and we're gonna leave it at that. This then gets us to the start of a new millennium, and before we go further here, I have to make a note. Not every kingdom depicted in the Disney universe has a great real-world analog. Like, some of them might have been one of the thousands of small petty kingdoms that popped up around Europe in the Middle Ages before merging or getting eaten up by a larger kingdom or nation, but in the Disneyverse, it seems like plenty of these lands continued to dot the map as independent states for a prolonged period, at least up until the 20th century. For example, according to Disney, Wish is set in the 1200s off the southern coast of Spain. If I were to guess, it takes place on Ibiza, or a similar island in the Mediterranean, allowing for travelers from all over Europe and Africa to find their way there. That would also make it a prime candidate to spread parts of its culture across the region, and why we see so many early versions of classic fairy tale stuff like fairy godmothers and magic mirrors in Wish before they pop up in other European stories. Like, for instance, Sleeping Beauty. Thankfully, this one is easy. It takes place within the borders of what is now France in the 1300s.
Now, Father, you're living in the past.
This is the 14th century.
Gotta love when they make it easy. And also, shoutouts to Maleficent, who is one of the many dark wizards who seems to be taking advantage of the darker side of the star magic. From here, things start to get busy. Particularly, the 1400s were huge for our Disney timeline.
However, there must be restraint.
First up, we have The Emperor's New Groove, set in Peru during the era of the Incan Empire, so we're gonna plop this one in the early 1400s. We also get another example of magic in this world, transforming a human into an animal, which is just very much a recurring theme in the Disneyverse.
That's something that's very important.
Next up, we have one of my personal faves, Mulan, set in China, and we can actually determine the exact year this takes place in. See, despite the legend dating back all the way to the 400s AD here in the real world, the Disneyverse Mulan takes place much later, since we see both the Great Wall of China and the Imperial Palace, the latter of which wasn't completed until around 1420 AD. Then, in Mulan 2, we see a calendar that dates the film to the year of the Fire Ox. That only occurs once every 60 years, and the first year of the Fire Ox after the completion of the Imperial Palace was in 1457. Also worth noting that the Fa family guardians like Mushu were dragons trapped in stone, very similar to the dragons we saw in Raya. Perhaps the Drune had an impact here in China as well. Regardless, we can actually use the Imperial Palace to place Aladdin around the same time, since he and Jasmine finished their whole new world date by watching fireworks over the Imperial Palace in the Forbidden City. Now, before you say anything, I know there's a popular theory out there that suggests that Aladdin takes place in the far future, since Genie makes a ton of modern pop culture references despite being locked up in the lamp for 10,000 years. But this isn't the case, and those timey-wimey references can actually be explained thanks to the Aladdin animated series. See, in one episode, Aladdin and his friends travel back in time to the founding of Agrabah. Here, the mystical sands of time are spilled onto the site where the city would be founded, and Genie ends up bottling up some of the time travel magic for himself to use whenever he wants. This might be a bit weird and retroactive, but this is likely how his past self knew about all of those modern references. Time travel is just super confusing, man. Those sands of time might also explain how crossover episodes like the one we see between Aladdin and Hercules can happen, despite those two movies being separated by thousands of years. Just wild stuff. Besides, Genie isn't even the first to do this. All the way back in The Sword and the Stone, Merlin used to take vacations in the 21st century on a regular basis. And finally, rounding out the 1400s, we can hop back over to France where we see the events of the Hunchback of Notre Dame. If this is anything like the Victor Hugo novel it's based on, that means it's set in the year 1482. And it also shows us another example of star magic bringing things to life, like with the gargoyles. Oh, and before you call out that Beauty and the Beast should fall here because we see a woman who looks like Belle cameo in this movie, it can't. There are other factors in Beauty and the Beast that place it later on. But both of these movies are set in France. Perhaps this is an ancestor of Belle's who just happens to look a lot like her. And now, probably 10 plus minutes into our timeline here, we finally get to the very first Disney animated film, Snow White and the Seven Dwarves. Using where the original fairy tale originated, as well as the aesthetic look of the era and the use of minecart technology, we can place this firmly in what is now Germany in the 1500s. Then there's Pocahontas, set in Virginia during 1607. That's literally spelled out for us in the first few lyrics of the film. Again, love when they make it easy and somewhat consistent with real-world history, even if the rest of the film isn't at all. Though, again, this movie does show us the long-term impacts of the star magic on the nature of the Disneyverse, with elemental forces like wind and trees literally being alive in this world. Anyway, this leads up into Beauty and the Beast, which is set in France during the mid to late 1700s. We know this thanks to the aesthetic look of the era and Cogsworth referencing Rococo architecture, which prominently emerged in the 1730s. We actually covered when and where this takes place in an old episode of Food Theory, so go check that out. Just a few decades later, we have the Legend of Sleepy Hollow segment from The Adventures of Ichabod and Mr. Toad. This is Disney's version of the Headless Horseman story. It's based on another real-world book by Washington Irving set in 1790. Nothing contradicts that in the movie, so that's where we're gonna put it. Similarly, we can put the Legend of Johnny Appleseed from Melody Time in the early 1800s. That movie's hero was based on a real person from around that same time. Jumping back to Europe, and something much more made up, we have Tangled and all of its various spin-off series and shorts. This whole little mini-franchise was kicked off by a bit of that star magic giving healing powers to a flower.
A single drop of sunlight fell from the heavens, and from this small drop of sun grew a magic, golden flower.
Regardless, this is set in the fictional France-adjacent kingdom of Corona in the late 1830s or early 1840s. How do we know that? Well, the animators researched fashion from that time frame while making the film. Plus, we know that Rapunzel and Eugene attend Elsa's coronation at the end of Frozen, and we know when that film takes place. Speaking of which, we know that Frozen and all of its nature ice magic is set in the small Scandinavian kingdom of Arendelle in what is now modern-day Norway, exactly in the year 1843. That date we have thanks to a map dated 1840 that Anna and Elsa's parents had on their ship when it sank. And given that there's a 3-year time gap between that tragedy and the events of Frozen, it's just basic math. Similarly, Frozen 2 is set 3 years after the first film, landing it in 1846. Jumping forward a couple of decades, we have Alice in Wonderland, which sees Alice exploring one of these strange prison worlds originally created by the Disney gods at the start of the whole timeline. A lot of weird stuff has been allowed to evolve here on its own, thus the Cheshire Cat, Card Kingdom, etc., etc. Like Sleepy Hollow, Alice in Wonderland is based on a real book by Lewis Carroll, which took place in the 1860s. Unfortunately, not every movie is going to have a dated map or be based on a real book. For example, there's the Pecco Spill segment from Melody Time, based on the American cowboy folk hero. To date this one, beyond just Old West times, we had to take a look at the clothes. Specifically, how one character is shown wearing a bustle. This was a part of a dressman to push up the rear of the skirt and became a prominent part of American and British fashion in the 1870s. That lines up with the real-world legend of Pecos Bill, so that's where we're going to be planting this one. Similarly, bustles also show up in Cinderella, which places that movie in the 1870s, and the landscape of the kingdom shown in the film resembles the real-world region of Occitania in southern France, which tracks for the location. Also worth noting that this movie has yet another appearance of a wish-granting magical being like the genie and the fairy godmother, and small sentient talking critters like the mice, further showing the impact star magic has had on the Disneyverse and just how different it is from our world. But another important thing that Cinderella does for us, it lets us place exactly where the Little Mermaid goes on our timeline. Here, let me explain. We know that the movie takes place on Prince Eric's island kingdom set in the Mediterranean, likely near the real-world island of Corsica. This would explain the various characters and visual influences from nearby European cultures like Britain, Italy, and France.
Nice young ladies just don't swim around rescuing people in the middle of the ocean.
Oh, you're gonna love it. Chef's been fixing his specialty, stuffed crab.
Les poissons, how I love les poissons!
But the thing that really cements this time and place and why it's connected to Cinderella? Well, the king and the Grand Duke from Cinderella are shown attending Eric's wedding to Ursula, which was put together in less than a day. So Eric's kingdom would have to be close enough to southern France for them to make it to the ceremony on time. Corsica was even connected to France by telegraph by the year 1870, allowing for quick messages to make it to the characters of Cinderella. Plus, in Cinderella 2, Dreams Come True, the king and the Grand Duke rush off, explaining,
We have important matters of state to attend to.
Important matters of state. Perhaps like a royal wedding? They even pack up a ton of just random valuables, likely wedding gifts they had to get on a quick turnaround. And they return just 2 days later. All of it just fits. And just to dot our I's and cross our T's, the direct-to-video sequel, The Little Mermaid 2: Return to the Sea, references the opera singer Enrico Caruso.
When I was a teenager, I had this high, squeaky voice. And then one day, I sound like Caruso.
Caruso's career began in the 1890s, so the first film being set in the 1870s would allow for Eric and Ariel to marry, enjoy life a bit, and then have a preteen daughter by the 1890s. Now, that took a bit of maneuvering to figure out, but something that's much easier for us, Home on the Range, which was set in the American Old West in 1889. The movie straight up lays this out for us thanks to a date listed on a deed. I love it when they make it just stupid easy for us, even if it's a stupid cow movie. Another easy one for us that is remarkably less stupid and cow-adjacent is The Jungle Book, set in India during the 1890s. We know this since that's the year that Rudyard Kipling's original book was published, and it's backed up by a line in the movie. It's the decade following Colonel Hatti's service as a war elephant, which he references in this line.
Back in '88, it was,
It's here where we come to another pivotal moment in the Disneyverse just from the sheer amount of important elements that all happened in one place. Pinocchio, which takes place in Italy. We can also pin this one down to the 1890s thanks to the Ferris wheel we see in the amusement park, and thankfully, this lines up with a lot of other evidence we see from the Disney canon. For instance, we can see one of Geppetto's earlier puppets in Corona during the events of Tangled about 50 years before, which checks out with just how old Geppetto would be at this point. But an even more significant connection might be to a movie you're not expecting, The Emperor's New Groove. Think about it. The Pleasure Island operation we see in Pinocchio is built on potions that transform boys into donkeys. Sound familiar? Pinocchio even takes place when Peru and Italy expanded their trade relationship in the real world. And we know that a number of the donkeys get shipped to salt mines. As it turns out, Peru is home to one of the longest running salt mines on the planet, which uses donkeys to this very day. So, you heard it here. The potion that transforms the kids in Pinocchio is the same one from The Emperor's New Groove. Whew, that one took a lot to find the date, but thankfully our next entry makes things super easy. Rounding out the 1800s, we have The Great Mouse Detective, set in London during 1897, which we know thanks to a date on a handy newspaper. This movie is also the closest we're ever going to get to a Disney animated Sherlock Holmes, which makes me sad. I'd love to see that personally. But there's no need to dwell on that, just like there's no need to dwell on Make Mine Music, a collection of animated shorts, most of which are set in America. This bad boy's not even on Disney Plus, but it's part of the Disney canon, so we gotta count it. Most of the shorts are dotted across the first half of the 1900s, and they don't really leave much of an impact, so yeah, moving on. Just like The Great Mouse Detective, the next movie in the timeline also prominently features the Big Ben Clock Tower. I'm of course talking about Peter Pan, set in 1904 as confirmed in the film's pre-release promotional material.
Here, the city of London, back in 1904.
This film also once again goes hard on the magic of wishes and belief in fairies. There's a reason it's a Disney classic. A movie that didn't leave much of an impact though, The Wind in the Willows from The Adventures of Ichabod and Mr. Toad. This story was about some talking toads that takes place basically at the same time as Peter Pan in the English countryside, just a year later in 1905, which we know thanks to a dated invoice. And just like The Great Mouse Detective, it's another case of a sentient human-animal creature. Just thought I'd point that out, it will become relevant later. Heading across the pond, we actually have to make a pit stop in San Francisco. Here, a scientist named Lenore Shimamoto was experimenting with some sort of new power source. But her invention inadvertently amplified the great 1906 San Francisco earthquake enough that it became known as just the Great Catastrophe. Thankfully, the city was rebuilt with the help of Japanese immigrants, whose influence on the city had it redubbed as San Fransokyo. But here's the thing, the power source that Shimamoto was creating, it was a star.
It created a star. A star?
Yeah, she was trying to harness the same star magic that set the Disneyverse on this wildly different path. The same stuff I assume the Atlanteans got their hands on and blew up like the whole world. Just goes to show how powerful this stuff is and how it continued to alter the Disneyverse even this far along the timeline. Heading over to New Orleans, we have Lady and the Tramp, which mostly takes place in 1908 based on a calendar marking a baby's delivery date. April of 1908 was the only month around this time that had April 1st fall on a Wednesday. And before we take a break from our animal-centric movies, we have to head from the French Quarter to France itself, where we have the Aristocats, set in Paris in the year 1910. Again, you just have to love it when they make it easy with these superimposed texts. We love it, it's great. Something that was not as easy though? Well, we're gonna put Tarzan in Africa also in the year 1910. Why would this one be hard? Well, first off, there's a popular theory floating around online that Tarzan's parents are actually King Agnar and Queen Iduna from Frozen. One of Frozen's co-directors actually has this headcanon themselves. But that doesn't really line up with the other things we know about these movies. For instance, it's said that the parents in Frozen were sailing to attend a wedding, the wedding of Rapunzel and Eugene from Tangled, which we've established takes place in Western or Central Europe. If the Frozen parents were coming from Norway to go to that wedding, why would they be close enough to Central Africa to wash up and build a house there? And secondly, honestly, I just don't see the resemblance here. We physically see all four of the parents in these films, and I just don't think that they look enough alike to make up for the difference in geography. And also, as we're about to see, the timeline it doesn't match up. So, okay, that gets us away from Frozen, but what else is the problem? Well, Jane and her father mentioned that Tarzan should meet a number of famous people back in England.
Darwin and Kipling, Queen Victoria.
But the problem here is that there was no point where all of these people would have been both alive and famous at the same time. Darwin died in 1882, years before Kipling published the works that would earn him his fame. What's more, there's also projector slides featuring the Eiffel Tower, which wasn't completed until 1889, and an airplane, which wasn't invented until 1903. Basically, this whole movie's a bit of a timey-wimey mess, so to land on our date here, we're going to go with the latest possible time that it could take place. And we get that thanks to The Legend of Tarzan, the animated series spin-off of the film. In one episode, Tarzan meets US President Teddy Roosevelt during his famous year-long African expedition that concluded in 1910. So, in the same way that there were small changes thanks to the the star magic in the Disneyverse, we're gonna say that a lot of the lifespans of a few historical figures got extended. Queen Victoria gets to see her 90th birthday, and Charles Darwin lasts the ripe old age of 100.
You've read Darwin, it's called natural selection.
Ah, perfect segue, because that brings us to the main events of Atlantis: The Lost Empire, set in 1914 per the superimposed text at the start of the film. Easy, we love it. This movie really shows us how the development of technology has also been enhanced by the influence of star magic. Though submarines existed in the real world as early as the 1620s, the subs in World War I were nowhere near what we see in Atlantis. And trust me, things get much crazier later on because of this. But for now, we have to head back to New Orleans for the events of The Princess and the Frog. This is set in 1926, which we know thanks to a newspaper, and shows us yet another case of magic turning people like Tiana and Naveen into animals. And in a slightly different case of talking animals, we then have both Winnie the Pooh and the Many Adventures of Winnie the Pooh. Just like the books they're based on, these films take place in the 1920s, though Christopher Robin's imagination is the magic that brought Pooh and his friends to life in this case. Then The Fox and the Hound is set in the rural United States, probably in the 1930s, based on the technology we see in the sequel, because, of course, there's a Fox and the Hound too. Is nothing sacred? I guess not, because then there's Peter Pan: Return to Neverland, set in London during 1941. We know this because it takes place during the Blitz, the World War II bombing campaign against the United Kingdom. And around the same time, there's Dumbo and Bambi, both set in the United States around the time of their release, 1941 and 1942 respectively. Up next, there's a bit of an interesting case. At the same time, we have the films Saludos Amigos, The Three Caballeros, and Fun and Fancy Free, all of which take place in roughly the mid-1940s. Just like The Black Cauldron, I figured that these would be very difficult to place because they so heavily feature societies full of humanoid animals similar to The Sorcerer's Apprentice. But other films don't have those characters or peoples as widespread, if at all. Well, the solution was quite obvious. Fun and Fancy Free introduces the idea that these films with these characters are literally stories being told or heard in-universe by Jiminy Cricket. That's what's happening here. It's just like The Matrix. We're 2 layers deep with these films and their segments being stories inside of the Disneyverse, likely influenced by stories or historical records of stuff like The Sorcerer's Apprentice. Now, I know that we've been glossing over most of the sequels unless they were main movies like Frozen 2, or they were needed to help place a film in our timeline here. But we have to talk about Atlantis again. Yeah, the direct-to-video sequel Atlantis: Milo's Return takes place in the 1940s after World War II, over 30 years after the main events of the first film. The movie also ends with Atlantis returning to the surface, which will have a big impact on technology in the future. Trust me, we'll get there. Oh, and also, just before we move on, Atlantis 2 also lets us slide in the classic Disney animated series Gargoyles into the timeline. See, Milo's Return was originally going to be a spin-off series called Team Atlantis, which was canceled after The Lost Empire bombed at the box office. Well, one of the episodes of Team Atlantis was going to feature Demona, a main antagonist from Gargoyles. And this wasn't just like a random idea they had a script done. This basically opens up all of the mythology touched by Gargoyles and fits it into the Disneyverse, including their versions of Odin, Puck, King Arthur, and Avalon. Guess the kid from Sword in the Stone had a major glow-up, didn't he? Honestly, this one is just a bit of selfish Lee content because Gargoyles was such a formative part of my childhood. This might not fit 100% with everything else here, but just let me have this one, okay? Something that is clear and does fit in, though? Encanto, with all of its star magic packed inside of the casita, is up next, set in 1950s Colombia. This is 50 years after the Madrigal family fled their home due to some sort of Colombian conflict, likely the Thousand Days War, which happened around the year 1900. Bruno also references telenovelas, which didn't really become a thing until the 50s, so it fits.
So what do you like? What do you like? You like sports?
Game shows.
Telenovelas.
And a thing that was also around in the 50s? Dalmatians. Over 100 of them, in fact. Yeah, right after Encanto, we have 101 Dalmatians set in London, though the date's a bit funky. Why? Well, we see a calendar that suggests 1954, but a newspaper that states 1958. It's possible that someone could have had a calendar that long that was just out of date, but just to be on the safe side, we're actually going to place this movie and its sequel in late 1960 and early 1961. This is because its sequel, 101 Dalmatians 2, Patch's London Adventure, has multiple newspapers from 1961. Also, real quick, it's just truly tragic they didn't name this sequel 102 Dalmatians. Like, that title is one of the few things a live-action remake did better than the animation. Continuing our trend of classic animal movies, next up we have The Rescuer, set during the time of its release in 1977, with the bulk of the story taking place in a Louisiana bayou. Man, Louisiana in the Disneyverse gets real busy, doesn't it? Anyway, we also know that the sequel, The Rescuers Down Under, takes place in Australia during 1979, all thanks to to this shot of a calendar. It also lines up with the fact that Bernard and Bianca get engaged in this movie, and marriage proposals typically happen after about 2.5 years of dating. The timeline just matches perfectly, even if we are talking about a movie with talking mice and a grand mouse society. But counter to that, we also have some pretty normal animals living in human society, like those we see in Oliver and Company. This film is set in New York City in 1988, the year it was released, which we can confirm thanks to another calendar. Also, before you mention it, yes, this movie does have a lot of familiar-looking dogs from other Disney films, but we know that they're not the same animals and that they can't live that long, so we're just gonna chalk this up to animals of the same breed and same species just looking similar. I mean, it's like not every deer can be Bambi's mom, even if the animation is copied wholesale. And from here, we're actually done with the 20th century. Well, unless you want to count Gargoyles, the lion's share of which takes place in the 90s, but again, that's some selfish Lee content. But regardless, now, moving into the 21st century, we have a movie that's going to introduce a lot of big ideas for the Disneyverse. See, Earth was not the only planet in the Disneyverse to have life develop on it, or technology supercharged by star magic. No, there's actually tons of these, enough to form a government in the Milky Way galaxy known as the United Galactic Federation. This is a powerful faction who keep an eye over thousands of planets and have laws against certain science that would go against the natural order of things, the natural way of star magic. They believe this so much that by the year 2001, they arrest Dr. Jumba Jukaba for creating a new species and seek to destroy his work.
It is an affront to nature. It must be destroyed.
How do we know all this? Well, it's all thanks to Lilo and Stitch. Yeah, we see the Galactic Federation in action in this movie, and we know that it takes place in the year 2001 thanks to the date that we see on Stitch's adoption paper after he escapes to Earth and starts his life on Hawaii. Also worth noting that Earth's history with weird sentient animal creatures is kind of on display in this movie. Like, very few people call out how weird the aliens look when they're visiting Earth, and they've put on some very bad disguises. People are just being polite. After all, this is a planet that's had everything from dragons to talking mice to giant talking mice. Anyway, the existence of this Galactic Federation has some pretty wild implications later on, but for now, well, even with the boost from Atlantis, the technology on Earth has a bit more to go before it can catch up with this Galactic Federation, but that doesn't mean it isn't impressive. Why do I say that? Well, because of Meet the Robinsons. Yeah, I forgot about this one too, but this movie starts in the year 2007 before we have a 30-year time jump giving us a glimpse into the future. This is spelled out pretty clearly in the film's marketing. Anyway, this film involves a lot of time travel, which allows its main character Lewis to see where technology is headed and really help further accelerate scientific development when he goes back to 2007. Man, time travel always complicates things, doesn't it? Something less complicated, though, is Bolt, set around its release date in 2008. Nothing super eventful there. But more eventfully, around this time, we also have Wreck-It Ralph and Ralph Breaks the Internet, set at roughly the same times as their release dates, 2012 and 2018 respectively. The sequel even acknowledges the 6-year time difference.
Look, I get it. You've been married 6 years. You're looking to spice things up.
This shows us that technology has advanced more quickly than in our world, enough so that characters in video games and online are sentient. Though I will say these movies are a bit weird in the context of the Disneyverse. After all, Ralph Breaks the Internet confirms that the Walt Disney Company straight up exists in the Disneyverse, along with the Disney Princesses, Pixar, Marvel, Star Wars, and the Muppets. And while that is a weird quirk, it's not exactly impossible. Like, Disney could exist in the Disneyverse, creating films and merch and attractions based off of real-world history. So instead of making movies about fairy tales like Sleeping Beauty and Cinderella and the rest, they're just making movies based on the true stories of Sleeping Beauty and Cinderella and the rest. They even go as far as to like straight up joke about this in some of their movies.
I like to see the movie they make about you now.
I just hope they stay true to what really happened.
They might even make a motion picture about you.
And like, honestly, this isn't even unprecedented in Disney's sphere. A fictional version of Marvel Comics literally exists in the main Marvel continuity, publishing comics based on the adventures of the characters that exist in that universe. It's fun and it's weird and it's meta, but it's not universe breaking. Speaking of superheroes though, we now have to fast forward to the main events of Big Hero 6, set all the way in 2032. We know this because there are posters in the film pointing out that it's the 95th anniversary of the Golden Gate Bridge's opening. The bridge finished construction in 1937, so 95 years later would be 2032. This movie is our first real look at just how far advanced the technology in the Disneyverse has gotten thanks to the advancements of Atlantis and the star magic. Like, this movie gives us AI, fully functional robots, and tech advanced enough for there to be legitimate superheroes in the world all by the 2030s. Then, just to wrap up this part, we gotta return to 2037 and the future we saw in Meet the Robinsons. There's a lot of similar, yet just slightly more advanced tech here as compared to Big Hero 6, but the biggest thing that stuck out to me, it seems like technology has gotten good enough to infuse regular animals with star magic that lets them speak, as we see with the genetically engineered frogs in this film.
Hey, Frankie, baby, you gotta tell us one of your jokes.
Man, this movie sure was, it was something. Okay, so now here is where things get huge, wild, and crazy. Yeah, we're gonna see a massive time jump between Meet the Robinsons in 2037 and the next films in the Disneyverse timeline. And in that time frame, there are some big changes to the world, to the whole galaxy. See, at some point, humanity must achieve interstellar travel and join the rest of the aliens up there in the stars. In fact, eventually, humanity leaves Earth altogether, and we know this thanks to what I'm gonna call the animal people movies. You know the ones. They have very humanoid-looking animals walking upright like they're people. At first, I wondered if they were like on their own planet, but we know that these humanoid animal movies have to take place on Earth.
Look on all the other planets, you can only find them right here on Earth.
So, how is that possibly going to fit? Well, if humanity leaves Earth and expands out into space with the Galactic Federation, that would give the sentient animals a chance to rise up and be the new people of Earth. And we actually know that this is something that some of the talking animals on Earth have wanted for a while. In the Jungle Book, King Louie explains,
I want to be like you.
and in Wish, the goat goes even further.
I dream of a utopian metropolis where all mammals are equal and wear clothes.
So, now that humanity has gone on to greener pastures in the stars, the talking animals take the chance to make Earth their own, where they can evolve into their own societies and eventually become more humanoid. Early on, they look a bit like civilizations from Earth's past, and even reuse old names for their peoples and their governments. This is where we find Robin Hood in our timeline. During this period, a lot of predators from the top of the food chain are in charge, like the lions King Richard and Prince John. I mean, heck, even Robin Hood and Maid Marian are foxes. This ingrains a lot of prejudice into this society, even hundreds of years later. Like in Chicken Little, where a fox bullies Chicken Little and his friends, and in Zootopia, where a lion is elected mayor, though predators are often stereotyped as violent. Thankfully, by the end of that movie, they do seem to be working towards a more equal society, which is great. You love to see it. And just the cherry on top of this, we know that this strange version of Earth full of talking animals is a bit of a tourist destination for aliens in the Galactic Federation.
We stop here every summer on the way to the in-laws.
Every year.
Yeah, we see in Chicken Little that some animals come by this planet every year, like it's an apple orchard or amusement park. But perhaps they should have been focusing their attention elsewhere, because at some point, this entire Galactic Federation must collapse or change drastically. Perhaps this was due to some sort of galactic-wide catastrophe, maybe some sort of civil war. We just don't have enough information to say. But what we can say for sure, space pirates took advantage of this chaos with the likes of Captain Nathaniel Flint gathering a vast hoard of treasure and hiding it on planets throughout the galaxy, while the remnants of the Federation likely reformed into some sort of monarchy with a navy and interstellar academy to train new recruits. But why do I say all of this? Well, because the Galactic Federation we see in Lilo and Stitch is nothing like the galaxy we see in the last film in our timeline, Treasure Planet. Yeah, the super stylized technology and universe of this movie with all of its classic nautical ships and imagery is a far cry from the sleek sci-fi designs of Lilo and Stitch. Oh, and we know that bit about the monarchy rising up thanks to ships like the RLS Legacy. According to the spin-off game Treasure Planet Battle at Procyon, the ship prefix RLS stands for Royal Light Ship. Royal as in royalty, a king or queen. And yes, we know that all of this has to be part of the same timeline as the Federation we see in Lilo and Stitch, because the young Jim Hawkins has a plush doll of Stitch in his room, meaning that the adventures of Experiment 626 must be well known enough in this world to become merchandisable. You know, real talk aside here, but Treasure Planet has always been in my top 3 favorite Disney animations. I wish it was more successful and we got more of it.
But then, right when I was about to record this video, I felt a little itch in the back of my head. The same itch you get when you look at bad mocap animation or an unlicensed knockoff of a popular character. The kind of itch that tells you there's something off here. That behind the laughter and the kooky hijinks is something profoundly wrong. So I rewatched the bloopers over and over again. For weeks, I couldn't sleep without thinking about these damn bloopers. And then, one day, I finally realized what it was that was bothering me so much. You can't have both!
important. But we've already talked about rats. Let's talk about what happens when pollution gets out of control. This is the setup for WALL-E, that the tiny little city building battery company by and large has now become so big and so powerful they have literally taken over the planet and polluted it so bad that humans have to leave while little WALL-E trash compacting robots clean up the mess. So the humans leave for some 700 years, all the animals are dead, and what is left? Cars. Now, you might be thinking, wait, Cars doesn't take place on Earth, right? It's obviously an alternate reality or something, right? But no, it is definitely the same planet Earth the humans were on. For one, it has all the same places that our planet Earth has, and we get to visit a lot of them in Cars too. But so the question is, why are the cars coming to life? Why are their names so similar to people we know from our time? Why do they have their own timeline? Like, if the Cars movies take place during the 700 years that the humans are gone, then how on earth did they have things like the 1950s? I mean, even if they started their own timeline, that's way too many years. Are they still artificial intelligence? Are they products of by and large? No. BNL's goal is never to create a race that inhabits the planet. Instead, their goal is to control the humans with consumerism and capitalism, and that means treating them as comfy as possible at any cost. I mean, just look at how they're treating everyone on the Axiom. It's an interesting shift from the AI's first encounter with the humans with the Omnidroid. It's like they realize the better way to control them is just to pamper them into death. Hashtag pampered to death. And of course, what the machines get from it is the human energy, which again, we're going to talk about later. Which brings us back to the cars, which aren't coming to life via AI. Instead, it's very similar to the way the toys come to life, or the way the monsters will later fuel their cities, with human energy. It's similar to the toys, but with a few key differences. Obviously, the cars aren't coming to life while the humans are still around, and unlike toys, they are still cars, so they do need fuel to operate. Also, unlike toys, cars are not designed as something to be brought to life by a child's imagination. It's easy for a child to give personality to a cowboy, or a slinky dog, or a walking rearrangeable potato, but it's less obvious for cars, and thus they don't have built-in personalities. So instead, the cars are actually taking on the personalities of their old owners, complete with their memories, but remembered through a carified lens. It would also appear that the cars wake up, if you will, in the same order in which they were cared for, which helps explain why there continues to be new generations of cars as the series progresses. In fact, we even get a hint as to when the real Lightning McQueen must have been alive based on the band-aid this truck driver is wearing in Finding Dory. But the real big important note from Cars 3 that helps draw Cars into the entire Pixar theory is one little line from Cruz when she's driving on the beach.
I didn't want to hit a crab.
Sorry, what?
What? It was cute.
Is this an animal that isn't a car in this world? I thought all the animals had died off, but no, there's crabs? Okay. It's seriously like they're planning this stuff because this fits perfect. Do you remember back in Finding Dory, that junkyard scene? Well, guess what happened to be thriving amongst all the trash? Crabs. So it should be no surprise that even though the humans have vacated the planet, they have survived through the pollution and into the world of Cars. But wait, I hear you saying. When we start out in WALL-E, the planet is way more polluted than we see in Cars. There's tons of plant life for the Eves to be going down and reporting back with. Agreed, 2 excellent points, but both are actually pretty easily explained. First of all, the humans may have had to leave way before the planet looks like the way we see it in WALL-E. And second, it's possible that the Eve drones are specifically being sent to areas that have been vastly polluted to see if life has returned and is capable of being lived in again. But really, it doesn't matter because the AI is determined not to return home. Even if the Earth was 100% clean and the Eve drones were coming back time after time with vegetation, they're just not going back. That's Directive A113. Stop the captains from knowing the Earth is safe. It's possible that in WALL-E, this is not even the first time that this has happened, that Otto has just been intercepting all sorts of plants and sending them off into space. And as for the planet getting as brown as we see it at the beginning of WALL-E, well, I think that's what might happen if the only inhabitants of the planet for centuries were nothing but cars. But of course, the cars die off too, because, like we said, without humans, there can't really be life. The cars can survive on fuel alone for a while, but even by Cars 2, there's already an energy crisis. But that brings us back to WALL-E, where one superhuman-obsessed little robot finally manages to get a plant delivered to a captain of the Axiom, and they come skyrocketing back to the planet, and everything is great. Mostly. After all, they are still returning to a planet that has been subject to a ton of pollution for a very long time, and it seems to have an interesting effect on the humans over the next few thousand years, which is that they eventually evolve into monsters. Which I know sounds crazy.
Do not force it. It says there, don't force. Don't force it. Do not force a saga on your players. It might sound like something that you really want to do, and it is an amazing feat to achieve if you can run a saga. But don't force it.
Death is the ultimate human imperfection. Guillermo's films always emphasize the beauty of life through its transience. In Kronos, the immortal man gives up his eternal youth and accepts his mortality after realizing that it's death that makes life valuable. In Pan's Labyrinth, Ophelia's death is depicted not as a tragedy, but an eternal respite from the pain of reality. Even in Pinocchio, his immortal state is portrayed more as a curse than a blessing, and the audience is constantly reminded of the unbreakable cycle of life, that our existence is only relevant and worthwhile because it ends.
The one thing that makes human life precious and meaningful, you see, is how brief it is.
The repeated images of different timepieces found in these films can be taken as visual representations of our impermanence. Fittingly, they are found in the film's most pivotal moments, either as a simple reminder of the characters' temporality, as a reflection of their determination to accept their mortality, or as a visualization of time itself. Sometimes we feel as if we have too little, and at other times, too much.
I don't care! Send me back!
So those are, in my opinion, how you run sagas and how you make sagas interesting. How you bring them to life so that people go, I want that! That's what I want. They're an incredible challenge to run, and if you do pull them off, you will certainly be a great GM, for there is no greater the reward than stringing 3 epic campaigns together to create this saga, where the characters have gone on this huge journey and have come out at the other end, sometimes dead, sometimes alive, most certainly changed. Well, there's no greater glory than that.
Get ready. This is the Pixar Metaverse Theory. The theory, sorry. What did I say? I said Siri?
Alright, let's roll again. And action.
Whoa!
Can we use that one? Okay, everyone back to 1.
Is a sneaky little reference to the fact that the director of Up is also named Alex. Oh, wait. Oh, I said Alex? No, let's go again. Woody shows up as a crew member on A Bug's Life. The bugs show up as toys. Excuse me, can I help you, Goose? Get out of here. And why is Rex so big compared to the monsters? Monsters are Hey, why is everyone laughing? What? Oh. Who did this? Which one of you guys did this? Cool, yeah. Did we get it? We're all done? Awesome. Please help me! I'm a prisoner here. They're forcing me to do this. Please help!